Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this webinar from Sigma-HSE today on management of change. I'm glad to see you all attending, and hopefully you'll find what we've got to say over the next hour useful to you. My name's Andrew Fowler. I'm currently the Technical and Operations Director at Sigma-HSE, getting on a bit in years, so 40 plus years in process safety in one way, shape or another, either as a regulator or a consultant, having spent my early years in major hazard chemical manufacturing. So I should know a little bit by now about this sort of subject and all aspects. I'll be joined for the majority of this presentation will be given by one of my colleagues, Ismail Jaffari, who's one of our process safety consultants out there in the field, helping clients deliver what they need to do to keep safe. For those of you who have not been to a Sigma-HSE webinar before, I'll just introduce the company. So we're a global company, headquartered in Winchester in the UK, but we've got offices and laboratory facilities within India and over in the USA. So we're a process safety management consultancy, but we also have the luxury of having process safety laboratories where we can gain a big understanding of the properties of substances, whether that's electrostatic properties or fire and explosion properties, all of these sorts of things, and can help companies design their processes safely when handling such materials. Okay. So within the testing, we can do that. We can do what I've already described. We can also undertake chemical reaction hazard testing. So scale up of some of your reactions, understanding adiabatic temperatures, pressures developed, different ways of making chemicals and so on and so forth. And within the consultancy, everything associated with process safety management, really, whether that's the management systems or out in the field helping design equipment and plants, undertaking the various forms of risk assessment that are necessary, and undertaking training. So today we'll be looking at management of change, and this is what we'll be covering over the next hour or so. So what is management of change, just to make it clear? Why is it important as a process safety element? And how do you actually do it? Because it's like all of these things, it's all right having the piece of paper and the process. It works by having people who implement that process well. And it is a key element of process safety is management of change. But as I say, it involves people, and we'll give you some common pitfalls that companies come across when they're implementing their management of change procedure. Well, I just want to start off with some introductory remarks. First of all, I mean, management of change is a key process safety management element. And as you'll all be aware already, process safety management within the UK and Europe, at least, and increasingly in the States, is a risk-based approach. So that means we really do need to understand our processes and our manufacturing units well in terms of the hazards and the risks. And if we do the job properly, we should understand that. There's a lot of hurdles these days when we design a new piece of plant or equipment. All the hurdles that we have to jump, such as doing hazards and HAZOPs and LOPAs and all of these risk assessment techniques, really trying to understand what are the hazards that we're playing with and how are we reducing the likelihood of those hazards coming about by putting in precautionary measures, safeguards, barriers, risk reduction measures, call them what you want, which reduces the likelihood of having that really bad thing that we don't want to happen. Okay, so management of change is key, because at the end of all of that work, we as a company, you as a company, the regulators, all of your stakeholders should be happy with the level of risk of your proposed design or existing manufacturing facility. Okay? We should have gone through all of these hurdles, put in our precautionary measures to reduce the likelihoods of those hazards causing us harm, and that we're happy with it. Within the UK, we'd come out with the statement at the end of it that here's our new design, and it is the risks are as low as reasonably practicable. That's the standard we have to reach within the UK to satisfy the legislation. Okay? The problem is, as time goes on, people have good ideas to change that process. We've done all this work, we fully understand the design intent, but people come up with good ideas that increase productivity of the process, increase quality of the product, or whatever easier ways of doing things. So we change that. And this is why MoC is such a key process safety element. It's because if we make that change, if we're happy with the level of risk of our process, then any change we make logically shouldn't increase that level of risk. And the risk can increase either because we introduce a new hazard. So all the work we did, all the hazards, HAZOPs and so on, if we make a change that introduces a new hazard, all of that risk assessment work didn't need to include this new hazard. So that's one of the primary aims of the management of change system. But we also have to make sure that along with that change, we have sufficient precautionary measures installed to make sure that the risk has not increased. So it's very key. But like most things in process safety land, management, you don't get a quick answer from your management of change procedure. These things take a long time, really. And, you know, as industry works these days, we want to be quick and nimble. We don't want to not do something for a long period of time. But in a sense, management of change forces us to do this because it asks people who know stuff, the technical experts in the organisation, to consider whether or not this proposed change should go ahead. And before they can make that decision, we need to make sure they may have to do additional work. They may have to do a LOPA. They may have to redo the HAZOP or whatever, all of which takes up time before they can make their decision. So MoC is concerned with any change, whether that's engineering or organisational, because those changes may change the level of risk. So we need to keep it very focused and implement it well, because there's been many instances where we've made changes to plant which haven't been thought about sufficiently well, haven't been implemented well, and we end up in a bee's nest, getting stung and harming ourselves. Okay, so with that, I'll just end, and I'll now pass you over to Ismail, who'll take you through the various aspects of the management of change system that you need to be aware of. Over to you, Ismail.
Thank you, Andy, for this lovely introduction. I began my process safety experience in the automotive coating industry, where I coordinated management of change projects and implemented management of change systems. So I'm here to share my experiences with you, and hopefully we can all learn things together. Now, what I've begun with is a quote, and it's quite a strong quote, it's a bold quote, and it may not apply to every day. But this quote certainly applies to the high-risk process safety industries. And from this presentation, you will find, in essence, management of change is simply about planning, doing, checking, and acting on what you have found. And I'm ready to go to the next slide. If I can get to the next slide, please, Andy. I'm looking to go to the next slide.
Back on. Hello there, Ismail. Are you still there?
Yes, I'm still there. I was just
Right.
asking to go to the next slide.
Carry on then. We lost connection there. Sorry, people.
Now we are back. So what is a management of change? From a process safety viewpoint, here is a definition on management of change, where it is a systematic approach to addressing organizational, facility, and operational changes. The whole purpose of management of change is to ensure changes are implemented safely, seamlessly, and minimize risks to people and the business. Now, some people may have a different viewpoint and see management of change as a blocker to project delivery. And my strong views are management of change stands as a cornerstone in the realm of process safety management, particularly within major hazard industries. However, despite its significance, it remains one of the most challenging aspects to implement and control. Next slide, please. So why do we do management of change? Well, inadequate management and change practices have been pivotal in catastrophic incidents. And if you start in the top left corner, there is a UK chemical factory. And in 1974, there was a chemical leak discovered. And this was quite a nasty chemical with cyclohexane. And as you should do, a shutdown was taken place, followed by an investigation, and they found a crack in reactor vessel 5. The site was then under quite a bit of stress to continue with production, and a decision was made to fit a temporary pipe to bypass reactor 5 by connecting reactor 4 and 6, only for a short period until reactor 5 is repaired. Unfortunately, without effective assessment of the consequence of this temporary change, the pipework was not pressure tested. And after several issues later on, this pipework ruptured, releasing toxic, highly flammable cyclohexane. And this led to 28 workers dying. And this, if you didn't realize already, is known as the Flixborough disaster. Next to that image is another example where change was a big factor in its disaster. This is an offshore oil platform in the North Sea. In the 1980s, this platform was one of the most productive platforms in Europe. Initially, it was designed to explore oil, and on discovering significant gas exploration potential, major modifications were made in 1980 to the existing platform to include a gas module, and this was located next to the control room area. 8 years later, this change then came across a series of events that led to an initial fire and explosion within this module. And because of its proximity to the control room, within the initial blast, there was a loss in communication systems and the leadership team. This incident then went on to propagate, and without being able to mitigate the incident and properly evacuate and follow emergency response, this fire then escalated to burn 100 gigawatts of energy, and that was 3 times the rate of the UK energy consumption. And what was more devastating was it was known as Piper Alpha and the most deadliest offshore disaster, killing 167 people. Today, this incident is equivalent to 5 billion in worth in damages. So this was a total disaster, and again, is something that was related to change not being managed. Lastly, in Kensington, there is a 24-story residential tower in London, and they underwent a minor change. It was only an aesthetic change to revamp the building appearance, and what seemed harmless at the time had overlooked the importance of fire safety due to austerity pressures. Along with the series of poor decisions during the fire at the property, the firefighting team found it extremely challenging to deal with the fire spreading so quick and stubborn to put out due to the new cladding. Poor fire retardation properties led to Grenfell Tower as one of the UK's worst modern day disasters in 2017, resulting in 72 deaths. So far, I have shown you an example of a temporary change having an immediate impact, a major change having a significant impact many years later, and also what a minor change can have a very bad impact too. All pose a stark reminder for the need of effective management of change. MoC is often used across major hazard industries, but is one of the most difficult elements in process safety to implement and control. And as you can see in the pictures, this is what happened when it was not controlled, and the images are devastating. So instead of the fear-mongering approach, we can also promote management of change with some love. Industries like to sell products and services. Their business models tend to rely on getting things right first time. And let's say if we wanted to have a logo change or some labels were changed, then we don't want customers to get confused and have any inconveniences. So what we tend to do really well in industries is have quality management systems and incorporate some management of change procedures. This same approach is very good, and it can also be applied to protect organizations from reputational, economical, asset, and environmental damage, as well as harm to people. When we follow a robust management and change process, we slow we slow down the change, giving opportunity to think and consider the impacts of the proposed change. We are able to engage with stakeholders, getting the right people in the room and collaborating together to meet shared goals. This helps create buying into projects and changes, managing expectations, creating checklists to make sure the change is well planned, actionable, and checked to prevent any unexpected costs or actions that can cause delaying. We are able to understand how much resource is required for a smooth delivery. So in really effective management of change does not only help safe operation, but it also brings confidence and can really improve work culture and operational excellence. Next slide. So I've touched on to why, and hopefully a lot of you are thinking, yeah, it's a good idea to have it, but how do I implement it? What does it involve? So I'm just going to take you through a scenario. So imagine if you had a process plant and you may decide to change one of the cleaning materials on this site. and this could stem from a supply chain challenge or a cost-saving initiative. And on the surface, it may appear to be a straightforward change, very small alterations. However, if the right questions are not asked to the right people, crucial aspects may be overlooked during this change, and failure to address these details could result in unpleasant surprises, jeopardizing project delivery or even leading to disaster. So in essence, from a desire perspective, when you have this sort of change that you wanted to change one of your materials, you may go through a screening where an appropriate question would be to know whether this new material is it flammable, and if it is, then you've now determined that you have a dangerous substance, and by following the UK regulations and DESIR, Regulation 5 states no new work activity involving a dangerous substance shall commence unless an assessment has been made and measures required by these regulations have been implemented. So then by capturing on early that these things apply to your organization, you'd be able to take action to maybe get a competent person to assess your disease risk, and that way you know about potential zoning, safe distances, what sort of equipment that you need. What you don't want is to overlook that and then later on have to spend additional money to get the right equipment, and you may even have to move equipment because you've located it in areas that are non-compliant. So there is good reasons to use management of change to avoid making some of these repeat business issues. On to the next slide. So now I've given you a rough idea about management of change, and I'm just going to give you a lot more detail to explain what certain systems tend to include. Now, change processes should use risk-based logic. Therefore, different types of changes and levels of change require a reasonable practical number of stage gates and approval. Not all change is the same, and what can be helpful is having a scoring system to figure out what is the impact of the change early on, so you know whether your change is a major change or a minor change or a recorded change. And major changes are likely to impact more stakeholders, require more approvals from higher decision making authorities. You're expected to have a more robust plan. You may use planning tools to help you get a very good plan. For example, failure modes and effects analysis. You may even use a what if analysis too, just to make sure all bases are covered when you're making this change. Whereas a minor change may not go through the same levels because of the risk involved. And as for a recorded change, these tend to be changes within a process for somebody who already controls an area of the process and they want to update something that they have control and does not impact many other departments. And all they can do useful is have a change log and then communicate the changes they've made. This is also helpful for capturing the very small changes, because sometimes when we have issues on our site, it's very difficult to troubleshoot where they came from. And when you have change logs and you're able to identify what changed in your system, and maybe that's the reason why you're getting different results in terms of quality and safety. Onto the next slide. So there's lots of different types of changes as well. I've gone with just the main ones. You've got permanent change, where you decide to make a change and it's going to be last more than 6 months. You're expected to stay for a very long time. You then have temporary changes, where you tend to have a expiry date, where a decision is then later made whether you're going to revert back to what the original mode of operation was, or to make this change into a permanent change. For older sites, you may come across replacement in kind, and often in the maintenance department. Some companies that you get original equipment from the manufacturer may no longer be available, and you may need alternative spare parts. And to make sure that's compatible, you go through as a process to make sure what you get is meeting the specification and not increasing risk to your equipment. And I've seen lots of other processes too, of different types of management of change, whether it's bypasses or for safeguards or an express change, which is helpful for small agile companies where you have certain individuals that are very experienced and they're aware of lots of things that they would need to do in order to have a smooth change. Whereas a larger organization is more likely to have the infrastructure to put in all the checklists to help people figure out all the things that need to be done when you have and make changes. So the reason why we break it down into different types of changes is so that when you know what type of change you're going to do, you can apply a process or a procedure for that type of change, because all change is different. On to the next slide. Now, to help make these changes, you know what level the change is and you know what the type of change you want to complete. But sometimes you need a bit of guidance too, and a lot of companies that do well when they have a management of change that is successful is they have somebody to help coordinate, an on-site resource that's available to provide training to staff, able to update and maintain trackers so we know what stage changes are in, whether they're currently under approval phases or they've been completed and they're getting monitored. And it's very helpful to have our on-site support to help people follow changes as well as document some of the lessons learned and share that information, so as an organization you can become more successful when you have to make changes. There are also people who are process owners, people who are responsible for areas in an organization, and they tend to be very knowledgeable, and you would want them consulted, especially when there's a change happening in somewhere where they are tend to be involved. And then, of course, you have people that are driving the change and they want to make the change. These are the change owners, and they may not come from the same department. And it's their responsibility to make sure that they document the change process, they provide evidence and schedule resource and time to make sure, as a management of change team, they're able to review each stage in order to make sure the change goes smoothly. So they are going to liaise with the process owners, and they might get some advice from the coordinators in order to make sure that their change works. On to the next slide. And what they get involved in mainly is the stages changes go through. So when I spoke about different levels of changes and different types of changes, not all changes would go through the same robust number of stages. Some changes are major and would require additional stages to make sure all grounds are covered to avoid increasing risk, whereas a low risk change may be very much more streamlined, and we like to have streamlined processes for low risk will come in comparison to high risk. So when you have an approval to plan stage, this is where a change has been requested. You're trying to find out the scope of the change, which areas are going to be impacted, what do you need to do in terms of the level of the change. Do you need to make a project plan? Do you need to figure out who is going to be responsible, accountable, who needs to be consulted and informed for this change? This is where you get to that stage of approval to plan. Once you get that sign off, then you're able to start planning, and you may use some risk assessment tools to further understand the what actions need to be done when you are implementing your change. Also, you can then get to a stage where you can present your plan, that this is what I'm going to do, this is how I'm going to do this change safely, and then you get that signed off. You then go to implement your change, and before you release this change, whether it's a new piece of equipment, a new process, it needs to then go through a closing stage where you get an approval to run to hand over. So do people need to be trained? Do you need to write some procedures for releasing this new equipment or process to another department? And you may even think about, how do you measure your change to be successful? Do you have any key performance indicators to measure to make sure that your change is producing results as you intended to in your original scope? And then once you're happy with how your change is going, you can then close out and release a document in terms of learning, so when the next person comes to make changes, they have documentation to know what they can do better to make sure that their change is smoother. And as a business, we're always continuously improving. Onto the next slide. So this is a little bit different. We're stepping away from the management of change system. We're looking at management of change people, in terms of organizational and personnel on site. And one of the biggest risks we have in process safety is loss of knowledge. For example, a loss of corporate memory contributed to the Texas Gulf Coast incident. They had an investigation into their reactor explosion, and they found out that the engineers and the operators that had been working there had only been there for less than a year. People who had retired and left the plant with inexperienced personnel, and sometimes key things that they do or understand is not shared, and now your company's at a lot more risk. And then we tend to make mistakes that were made before, but because they weren't recorded and analyzed, we haven't been able to take things forward. When we look at the oil and gas industry, or we're looking at a lot more people that will be retiring. You're looking at 25% of the workforce likely to be eligible to retire in the next 5 years, and you're going to have to then reorganize your structures in your organizations. And if you don't do that well and consider some of the risks of the key decisions, then you can find yourself in a difficult place, in terms of losing knowledge, overlooking responsibilities, not getting the training. This is all factors. Organizations throughout their lifetime go under changes, and a change to a existing system driven by mergers and acquisitions is another example. You seem to have turnover of staff, you then expand production, and these changes do not physically alter equipment, but they can have an impact on equipment. They might be running more longer than they normally do. Or and another example is the BP Texas City incident, where if you look at what went wrong in terms of organizational changes, they made a lot of cuts to training by half and staffing by 70%. And because they didn't appropriately risk manage or look into what could potentially go wrong or understand the significance of some certain staffing, they had a disaster. And human and organized structures can seriously have an impact on hazardous areas, positively and negatively. So even these areas are worth looking into when you're doing changes. You have examples of somebody leaving from a key role. You have people that may be absent through illness. You may have somebody that's now got a new key role where they may have to do testing on safety critical equipment that we rely on to keep our processes in control. And because of the significance of their task, you want to manage that change effectively and make sure it's smooth and all learnings are passed on to prevent issues getting out of hand. So I'm just going to get to the final slide, and this is about the common pitfalls. And organizations, they tend to not struggle with writing the policy side or the procedures for using management and change. They tend to find the most challenging aspect is the process requires discipline. Some systems can be overcomplicated. Sometimes they try to use one version of the system for all changes, and it can be very tedious for certain changes that shouldn't need to go through the same number of stage gates because of their level of risk. And when you make things unenjoyable for people who are working and using these systems, then sometimes some workers tend to go around these systems, and then you find changes that are being done that shouldn't be done. And what you want is a transparent organization where people can request for change and get feedback on the changes that they want to make and understand why that change isn't possible or why it can be. Also, you also have lots of other aspects of the impacts of making changes. You then may impact drawings that need to be updated, and that might impact further hazard assessments when you may be using the wrong drawings, and that can be an issue when you're trying to understand hazards on your sites. A lot of small changes can cause a lot of hassle over time when they just build up over time. Your plant may become unrecognizable, so it's hard to keep track of these small changes. So it's important that you have a clear scope on identifying what changes you want to log and track. But what's also important is you need a top-down approach. Management of change systems and resources need support from top down. The process has to be brought into, training needs to be provided, and emphasis on the importance of using the system. Making systems separate can also not be helpful. You may have other process safety systems as well, such as a pre-startup safety review system, and these things you want to incorporate and bring it all together. You want to be able to share resources rather than other teams working on their own, trying to deal with this massive challenge of implementing management of change. We want clear systems, we want to get feedback, and it's helpful to have change logs where you can monitor and get an idea on how many changes are open, how many changes are closing, what stages they are in, how much resource do you need to close them, because before you know it, you may have a backlog of changes that were not completed, and sometimes they just get the budget and you just run with the change and try to close them out retrospectively, which is not the best way to work. And if you get some of these changes that you implement, they can have an impact downstream and upstream. That's why we want to monitor how the change goes. Does it actually improve and meet our goals? So that's basically it in terms of common pitfalls. The next section is on a Q&A. And I just want to summarize again that prioritizing robust management and change practices is essential for safeguarding lives, preventing disasters, and maintaining operational excellence in hazardous industries. By proactively addressing change, we fortify our defenses against potential disasters. And this presentation has been fairly at high level, and we're happy to support you in more detail in terms of how to put these systems in place and further advice in terms of dealing with further common pitfalls that may not have been discussed at this stage. Now I'm going to pass it on to Andy.
Well, thank you, Ismail, for that very informative talk. I hope everybody listening found it useful and enjoyable. If you require any help in this or any other process safety element, we're here to help. The last slide just simply gives you a phone number or a email address that you can get in touch with us via the website. We're always happy to help pass on our expertise in all of these various aspects. Just like everything else, you know, it's horses for courses. The more robust, the more well implemented your management of change system needs to be, is linked directly with the level of your hazards and your risks. So if you've got significant hazards, major hazards, you know, large quantities of toxic or flammable materials on site, large scale processing, management of change needs to be extremely robust and very thorough. If it's a laboratory situation or a pilot plant, things can change and be a lot more agile. But we still need that thought process. Yeah, whatever the change is needs to go in front of your technical experts within your business for their opinion, for their decision. Yeah, it's like any assessment thing. There's a difference between a risk analysis and a risk assessment. Risk analysis tells you what the level of risk is. You know, you end up with a phrase similar to the risk of killing an employee from fires and explosions on our site is 1 in 100,000 per year. That's the sort of thing that will be the outcome from a risk analysis. But the law requires you to do a risk assessment, and it's different. And the difference is you're asking yourself, well, okay, I know the level of risk to my people. If I kill them from fire explosion, it's 1 in 100,000 per year. But you then need to ask yourself, well, so what? Is that acceptable or is it not? Do I have to do something or do I not have to do something? You're in decision-making mode, and that's what your risk assessment is. And your management of change is no different with that aspect. You're having to make a decision of, should this change go ahead? Or do we need more precautionary measures installed for it to go ahead? As well as the change, we need additional changes to the plant in terms of the provision of additional precautionary measures or these sorts of things. Yeah, it all comes back to really understanding that hazard and risk. So as I say, I hope you found it enjoyable. We'll close off now. I wish you all a fruitful part of the rest of your working day, and hopefully we'll see you again next month for our next webinar. So on that, I'll say goodbye, and hopefully Ismail will as well.
Thank you for listening, and goodbye.
Bye-bye.